Now the forced approach, we stay with the deductive one, but now we turn the relationship around. Just use supply chain management as the theory and explain something else. Now we use something else to explain supply chain management. That's why we call it theory revision, theory refinement. So we take up constructs from outside supply chain management and relate it into supply chain management. Therefore, we do something which is quite common, particular in management, but I have also seen such elements in the political sciences. We basically borrow theories from somewhere else. Yeah? In our case, quite often we turn to strategic management, but we can also turn to even sociology, which you sometimes see in institutionalism, that we take up elements from somewhere else and borrow them inside our base. You are familiar with this one by now, so I do not need to repeat it. As I said, this is my continuing argument so that you see a line of arguments running through. Here you now see a coding table. You see it's really broken down: orientation, continuity, collaboration, risk, and proactivity. And they are coded against here a food industry example and a bit of an automotive one. I just center on the food one for the next arguments. What you then also see here is we can look at what is particularly prominent in the food industry, the standards and certification in line with the argument that I just made. You have to make sure that wherever you are, the food is of the appropriate quality, particularly if you sell it. If you produce it for itself, well, even then it holds. Then you have to monitor yourself, but basically it's still the same. Yeah. We then find differences, for example, in the automotive industry, where we find a bit different counts, but even their standards and certification and also pressure groups is quite relevant. Here you see some differences, yeah, so much higher percentages, but overall quite some arguments that we can see there accordingly. Now we combine this with an approach inside strategic management, which you do not need to know in detail. We call this dynamic capabilities. This is a part of the wider set of the resource-based view. You almost do not really need to understand the single elements being mentioned here. We have the supply chain management categories. That's basically a condensation of the other framework that are now used multiple times, and link this into these capabilities. You see here, to understand who's in my supply chain, do I have to change my supply chain, just to point to the supply chain reconceptualization as one element. And then also knowledge management. How do you ensure that the people actually know and that they can do and be aware if you go to poor environments, and we have done so several times, then you cannot assume that every farmer could read and write. So how do you manage with them? How do you work with them? Yeah? Shortcutting this a little, we have done the analysis then and broken it even later on down into two subsets. And the one is on the one that I'm just mentioning here now, to stay with my food argument. It's just the food industry. You see we have here the first time phases 2002 to 2013. We cut the time phases just against the number of papers, so that we have similar number of papers. That was for us more important than having a similar time span. What you see in the first time span, everything centers in standards and certificates. This is the core argument that we find in the food industry. Now moving on in the debate, and if you look at it in the 2010 onwards, we had a much more debate on sustainability issues, on social conditions, on working conditions, on decent work, in line with the development of the ICDD. And in the second period, you see we now have 2014 to 2018, we see that the standards and certificates are still there, but the stakeholders have moved in. They have now an own box. We have still the more risk-centered argument, almost in line with the previous slide, but now we have a collaboration argument that is the top center of this picture, which is now knowledge sharing, long-term relationships, and enhanced communication. They move into the center. So we see how the academic debate turns from just standards and certificates into driving it forward. We see really how the theory that people work with over this couple of years changes, and the dynamic capability approach, trying to look at the dynamic perspective of management, allows us to do so and allows us to analyze this. And what can we conclude here? Of course, we said this needs to develop further. And if you look at, for example, again, the stakeholder box, which is in the one corner, they are still not too connected into all of this. So we can assume, and we suggest, and we predict, and we demand that the stakeholders play a more prominent role in the years to come. So this is the next step to be taken. Yeah? This is it. Summing it up, because this was the first approach, here's a table bringing all of this together. You see that I use now the terminology initially introduced on the theory side, definitions, borders, limitations, and variables, and I label the approaches. So we have a building theory approach, we have a developing new understanding approach, we have a supply chain management, a theory and refining of supply chain management approach, but you can replace supply chain management, and I hope you got this by now with other elements, and of course this can be political science and other fields of particularly the social sciences, and we can also enrich theory. So you see how we can do so, and I almost urge you, if you would go and take such a literature review in its own right as a piece of research, then be aware and clarify for yourself what actually you want to do and specify this upfront, and don't run into the trouble on later on trying to understand what you actually did. Then you typically have issues in justifying this. Yeah? We see that we've summed this up further. We also have the prediction case. There's a bit of an overlap. On here you see that there are some more examples used. That's particularly also, you can now read this in a paper, and there you would also find other examples beyond our own research being used there, and helping to gain an understanding of such particular approaches. Last but not least, what did I try to do? I tried to clarify the role of theory in literature reviews. I walked through 4 different approaches. I used examples from our own research, but be assured other people use these approaches already, and we contribute therefore to this understanding, and it should be an upfront understanding before you start your piece of research, and be aware of what you do so that you then have a sound justification and will not run into troubles writing up your thesis or paper. Many thanks for listening and following through this presentation with me.